So thank you for coming this afternoon. I feel as if I ought to be chanting the Passion at this stand. Maybe in a way I am, when you hear what I have to say. So of course we're coming up to a very important anniversary. April 3rd of this year marks the 50th anniversary of the promulgation of the Novus Ordo Missae by Pope Paul VI in his 1969 Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum, the provisions of which were to go into effect on the first Sunday of Advent that year, which was November 30th, 1969. When we look back a half-century later at this monstrous masterpiece of liturgical reform, and truth be told, it is no longer only self-proclaimed traditionalists who lament a job badly done, we often feel moved to ask the simple question, why? Why was it deemed necessary to make so many and such radical changes in the Mass? For an explanation, we must look to the Pope, who, more than any other figure, was responsible for pushing forward the liturgical reform, handing down not only a new rite of Mass, but also, in like manner, new rites for all of the sacraments, and indeed new versions of almost everything to be said or done in church. A figurative sack of Rome that throws the work of Alaric and Charles V into the shade. Where can we look to find the Pope's explanation? We do not need to have recourse to conspiracy theories. There are a plethora of addresses, letters, and other documents that allow us not just a glimpse into the mind of Montini, but a leisurely review. He was frank and outspoken about the liturgical reform, which was and had been his passion prior to and during his pontificate. I should note that of the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, he certainly can be counted in the 5% of the most progressive as far as liturgical thinking is concerned. Above all, however, we ought to look carefully at three general audiences in the 1960s. The first from March of 1965, and two from November of 1969. And you have, if you got a copy of this handout, I thought it would be worthwhile to prepare for you a text of all three of these addresses. It fits neatly on one folded sheet. If you don't have this text, there are extra copies available. Leave them up here. Before descending into the details of these general audiences, I will make a theological argument about how we as believers should understand the historical development of liturgy in the Catholic Church. I am convinced that this is the only way to see the magnitude of what Pope Paul VI desired to do, and in the judgment of most people, succeeded in doing. So I want to talk for a moment about the laws of organic liturgical development. In his 1947 encyclical on the liturgy, Mediator Dei, Pope Pius XII pointed out a theological error in the tendency of some members of the liturgical movement to reach back to supposititious liturgical rites of ancient times, a legendary golden age, while excluding or denigrating later periods of church history such as the Middle Ages or the Baroque. Speaking of some persons who are bent on the restoration of all the ancient rites and ceremonies indiscriminately, Pius XII says, quote, "The liturgy of the early ages is most certainly worthy of all veneration, but ancient usage must not be esteemed more suitable and proper, either in its own right or in its significance for later times and new situations, on the simple ground that it carries the savor and aroma of antiquity. The more recent liturgical rites likewise deserve reverence and respect. They too owe their inspiration to the Holy Spirit, who assists the Church in every age, even to the consummation of the world. They are equally the resources used by the majestic spouse of Jesus Christ to promote and procure the sanctity of man." Unquote. Pius XII is writing in 1947 about avant-garde liturgists who want to leapfrog over the Baroque and medieval periods, in other words, over the Roman Rite as codified after Trent, to arrive at a pristine apostolic liturgy. In 1947, the Roman Rite was still very much intact, as vintage photos of Pius XII's magnificent papal liturgies evince. The liturgy committee that was to give Annibale Bugnini his first post at the Vatican and eventually produce a new Holy Week was yet to come. So when Pius XII talks about more recent liturgical rites, he is talking about medieval and Baroque developments, culminating in a Tridentine codification, of which the 1570 Missale Romanum is the flagship. The key points to take away from this paragraph are, first, that something's being more ancient does not ipso facto make it better. Second, that the historical development of the liturgy is not an accident that God permits, but a plan that he positively wills, inspired by the Holy Spirit and used by the head of the Church to sanctify the members of his body. Indeed, this passage reads rather like a commentary on Canon 13 of the 7th session of the Council of Trent. Quote, if anyone says that the received and approved rites of the Catholic Church that are customarily used in the solemn administration of the sacraments can be looked down on, or that ministers can without sin omit them according to their own whim, or that any pastor of churches whatsoever can change them into other new rites, let him be anathema. Unquote. The 7th canon of the 22nd session of Trent is also highly pertinent. This canon states, quote, if anyone says that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church uses in the celebration of Masses are incentives to impiety rather than offices of piety, let him be anathema. Unquote. When the Council of Trent pointedly says which the Catholic Church uses, we are given to understand that all of the liturgical ceremonies, vestments, and external signs received from tradition are offices of piety and not incentives to impiety, as some of the Protestants were saying. Thus, the view later popular with 20th century reformers that aspects of the classical Roman rite are to be considered corruptions of authentic liturgy and detrimental to the spiritual life of the faithful is anathematized ahead of time. In the same spirit, the Roman Catechism, published in 1566, 3 years after the Council of Trent was concluded, says this about the Mass in particular. Quote, the sacrifice is celebrated with many solemn rites and ceremonies, none of which should be deemed useless or superfluous. On the contrary, all of them tend to display the majesty of this august sacrifice and to excite the faithful when beholding these saving mysteries to contemplate the divine things which lie concealed in the Eucharistic sacrifice. Unquote. Christ promised that when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will teach you all truth. Cum autem venerit ille spiritus veritatis, docebit vos omnem veritatem. John 16:13. This fullness of truth includes the fullness of liturgy. One would expect, if the Church is truly governed by the Spirit of God, that her liturgy would, in its large lines and accepted forms, mature and become more perfect over time. Would it not then follow that the rate of change will slow down, and the Spirit's work will gradually shift from inspiring new prayers to preserving prayers already inspired? A liturgical rite will grow in perfection until it reaches a certain maturity, and then will cease to develop in any but incidental or minor ways. So one of the handouts you have, it's sort of contained as an insert, is a chart that I made. And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm very excited to share it with you. But I made it for this trip. It's never been published, although it's coming out on Rorate at some point. But the reason I'm happy about this is it's finally a way for me to visually represent what I think has been the attitude of all Christians, Eastern and Western, until the 20th century. And it's kind of a separate topic. What happened in the 20th century? Why did everybody start thinking differently? I think some of that will come out when we look at Paul VI. But the traditional view of liturgical development is like this, right? Line A, the descending line, represents the Holy Spirit's role as creating Christian liturgy where it doesn't yet exist, brooding over the waters of Jewish, apostolic, and Greco-Roman ingredients. This role declines as the Church is led to the fullness of truth in her public worship, even as the need for new creeds declines as the formulation of dogma reaches mature expression. On the other hand, line B, that's the ascending line, represents the Holy Spirit's role as preserving and fructifying the liturgy as it already exists. The fulfillment of Christ's prayer, keep them in the truth. This role increases as the public worship of the Church is more and more actualized, as it gives ever better outward expression to the mysteries of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. We would expect these two roles to be inversely proportional. On this basis, we can see that radical changes to the liturgy, such as those done in the 1960s, constitute a sin against the Holy Spirit in both of these pneumatological roles, since on the one hand, the age appropriate to the formation of new liturgical rites has long since passed. It had its time. There was a moment for the formation of new liturgical rites. And on the other hand, the preservation of the rites in existence is likewise under the providence of God. So I can't fully expound everything that's here, and also I put on the back of this chart what I call the laws of organic liturgical development, which you can read at your leisure. It's really just explaining all this more. But basically, you can see as you go through history, right, this crystallization, condensation, stabilization of the liturgy. Already by 600, by the time Pope St. Gregory dies in 604, right, the Roman canon is definitive. By the time you reach 1200, you have a kind of medieval flourishing fullness of the liturgy. And then by the time you reach 1570, it's not surprising that we can have codified the Roman rite with all the sacramental rites, the blessings, the pontificale, all of these things, in such a way that there would be no need to change them in any significant way anymore after that. And that's why we had them stably for 400 years. Well, more than 400 years, but almost 400 years before the Novus Ordo and all the other changes that came out. So I think what we can say that at least the traditional view is that the liturgy reaches a certain maturity and perfection. It does not corrupt. And of course, the liturgical reformers said the opposite. The liturgy should always be changing. Therefore, the Trinity liturgy is fossilized, ossified. It's dead. It's like a fly in amber. These are the kind of things that they said. But I'm convinced that makes no theological sense whatsoever. All right, in the interest of time, I will turn to the three general audiences of Paul VI. The first text we will look at was delivered on March 17, 1965, 10 days after Pope Paul VI celebrated the first ever Italian language Mass at the Church of All Saints, Ogni Santi, in Rome. In spite of official rhetoric, there is little evidence that the people rejoiced. A plaque memorializing the event in Ogni Santi was vandalized so many times that a new plaque finally had to be placed high on the wall, out of reach of disgruntled parishioners. So be careful, Father, before you put up any commemorative plaques in the church. You better be careful that people really appreciated whatever it was. Maybe a plaque for Cardinal Burke and Bishop Schneider. Actually, you already have their pictures up there. It is hard to know what to be more astonished about in this address. The sheer contempt for the common man with which the audience drips, or the sheer fantasy land into which the Pope enters when describing the anticipated benefits of the new liturgy unveiled at Ogni Santi. Remember, this was not the Novus Ordo, which was 4 years away, but a heavily simplified Tridentine Mass conducted in Italian, except for the Roman canon, with the celebrant facing the people, standing at a temporary altar placed outside of the sanctuary. So that was the setup on March 7th, 1965. And it's quite interesting, in the mid-60s, all of the reactions to the new liturgy that you read about, it's all to this heavily simplified Tridentine Mass. It can be a bit confusing when you read somebody like Evelyn Waugh's reactions to the new liturgy, and you're thinking, what's he talking about? This is what he's talking about. The Pope says there have been negative reactions and positive reactions. The negative reaction is one of a certain confusion and annoyance. Those are his words. Quote, previously, they say, there was peace. Each person could pray as he wished. The whole sequence of the rite was well known. Now everything is new, startling, and changed. Even the ringing of the bells of the Sanctus is done away with. And then those prayers which one doesn't know where to find, Holy Communion received standing, Mass ending suddenly with the blessing, everybody answering, many people moving around, rites and readings which are recited aloud. In short, there is no longer any peace, and we now know less than we did before, and so on. Unquote. This is Paul VI. Right? This does not seem an altogether unreasonable reaction. As far as the Pope is concerned, however, Catholics who react this way have a paltry understanding of what they are doing. Quote, "We shall not criticize these views because then we would have to show how they reveal a poor understanding of the meaning of religious ceremonial and allow us to glimpse not a true devotion and a true appreciation of the meaning and worth of the Mass, but rather a certain spiritual laziness, which is not prepared to make some personal effort of understanding and participation directed to a better understanding and fulfillment of this, the most sacred of religious acts, in which we are invited, or rather obliged, to participate." Unquote. One wonders when a pope has ever said something more self-righteous, presumptuous, insensitive, and unjust. I suppose everyone before the Glorious Revolution was spiritually lazy, unprepared to make even some effort to understand, and altogether bereft of participation in the mysteries. The popularity of liturgical movement authors like Dom Prosper Guéranger, Pius Parche, Gaspar Lefebvre, and Ildefonso Schuster, whose commentaries on the Mass instructed and inspired precisely those laymen who were startled and disturbed, is passed over in utter silence. It's as if the liturgical movement hadn't even existed. Montini continues by explaining that reform always causes people to feel upset because deeply rooted religious practices are being tampered with. But that's okay. Soon everyone will love it. And we'll make sure that no one can settle back again into silent devotion or laziness. The congregation will be alive and active, he says. Everyone must participate. Now one must listen and pray. Apparently they weren't doing either before. Activity is the order of the day. We will finally have a liturgy that is not mummery. These are his words, performed merely according to its external form. But, quote, an immense wing flying towards the heights of divine mystery and joy, unquote. The positive reaction, on the other hand, is, according to Paul VI, that of a majority of Catholics, young and old, uneducated and scholarly, the earnestly devout and the urbanely cultured, insiders and outsiders, who greet the changes with enthusiasm and praise. At last, they say, one can understand and follow the complicated and mysterious ceremonial. The Pope declines to explain how simplification and easy accessibility fit with complicated and mysterious, unless his meaning is that a ceremony that was once complicated and mysterious will henceforth cease to be either. At last, quote, the priest speaks to the people, unquote. But wait, I thought that liturgy was addressed primarily to God. One old gentleman, the Pope says, gushed to a priest that, at last, in this new way of celebrating Mass, he fully participated in the sacrifice, possibly for the first time in his life. You can find all of this in the address. I'm not making it up. But some say this excitement will quiet down and turn into habit. But Pope Paul expresses the hope that the new form of worship will continue to stir up what he calls religious enthusiasm, so that the gospel of love will be realized in the souls of our time. He does not seem aware of Monsignor Ronald Knox's classic critique of religious enthusiasm. It is just this hankering for feelings of enthusiasm or excitement that has led to ever-repeated efforts to stir up or stimulate congregations ever since the 60s, with ever-diminishing returns. This papal address is notable for the number of times it uses the word new. New, startling, changed, new order, new scheme of things, new liturgical books, new form, new liturgy, new habit, liturgical innovation. If we add up these phrases 11 times. Some Catholics today are critical of traditionalists who speak of the Novus Ordo. I don't know if you've ever encountered that reaction. You shouldn't call it the Novus Ordo. But here we have a pope identifying the interim missal of 1965 as a Novus Ordo, when it was vastly less of a novelty than the Missal of 1969. I think we owe it to Pope Paul to use his terms when we talk about his reforms. He did not try to hide the fact that there had been a sea change. So you have papal authority endorsement for saying Novus Ordo. Many notable Catholics of this period have left us records of their reaction to the new Mass of 1965, which in retrospect turned out to be a halfway house. Evelyn Waugh and William F. Buckley Jr. left us choice words about it, but I shall quote what Dietrich von Hildebrand wrote in 1966. Quote, "The basic error of most of the innovators is to imagine that the new liturgy brings the holy sacrifice of the Mass nearer to the faithful, that shorn of its old rituals, the Mass now enters into the substance of our lives. The question is whether we better meet Christ in the Mass by soaring up to him, or by dragging him down into our own pedestrian workaday world. The innovators would replace holy intimacy with Christ by an unbecoming familiarity. The new liturgy actually threatens to frustrate the confrontation with Christ, for it discourages reverence in the face of mystery, precludes awe, and all but extinguishes a sense of sacredness." Unquote. Now we turn to a pair of general audiences given 4.5 years later, in the month of November 1969, on the last day at which the Novus Ordo Missae was officially to go into effect. At least in Italy, it varied from country to country. The Pope was really feeling the heat at this moment. He had promulgated the text of the Novus Ordo Missae 7 months earlier on April 3rd. The short critical study of the new order of Mass, more commonly known as the Ottaviani Intervention, this was written by a group of Roman theologians with a cover letter signed by Cardinals Ottaviani and Bacci, was completed by June 5th, but not published until a few months later. Somehow it did not come to Paul VI's knowledge until September 29th, according to historian Yves Chiron. That reminds me of a quip about a bishop is one who never has a bad meal and never hears the truth. So that seems like Paul VI was the last one to find out about the Ottaviani intervention. The popular press picked up the story and made a great deal of it. Paul VI sent a short study to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, whose prefect reported to him on November 12th that, in his opinion, the study was worthless. That's not an opinion shared, of course, by many who read it. This was only 1 week prior to the general audience of November 19th that we're just about to talk about. We must bear in mind, then, that this and the following week's address are Paul VI's attempt to defend the entire project of the Novus Ordo in the face of its critics and for posterity. It is his Apologia pro missa sua. What is perhaps most striking about these addresses is the Pope's penchant for gratuitous assertion and his stark authoritarian tone. He wants us to believe that nothing really central has changed, while at the same time listing and doubling down on one enormous change after another. For those who take seriously that a developed liturgical rite is a kind of body-soul composite in which one cannot readily separate what it is from how it is done, how it looks, sounds, smells, and feels, the case he makes for essential identity is far from convincing. On November 19th, again, the Pope does not shy away from the language of novelty. He speaks of a new rite of Mass 4 times, a new spirit, new directions, new rules, new and more expansive liturgical language, innovation twice. He closes with the guarded sentiment, do not let us talk about the new Mass, let us rather speak of the new epoch in the Church's life. In a colossal understatement, the Pope says, quote, the Mass will be celebrated in a rather different manner from that in which we have been accustomed to celebrate it in the last 4 centuries, from the reign of St. Pius V after the Council of Trent down to the present, unquote. A rather different manner. He shows admirable candor in getting right to the point. Quote, this change has something astonishing about it, something extraordinary. It's the extraordinary form. This is because the Mass is regarded as the traditional and untouchable expression of our religious worship and the authenticity of our faith. We ask ourselves, how could such a change be made? What effect will it have on those who attend Holy Mass? Unquote. Very good questions. But Paul VI is amazing at expressing the concerns that people have. His answer is feeble. Just pay attention to the explanations you will get from the pulpit and in religious literature, and trust that a clearer and deeper idea of the stupendous and mysterious notion of the Mass is just around the corner. Again, he shows frankness in admitting that the faithful will have spontaneous difficulties. Paul VI claims that the new Missal is, quote, due to the will expressed by the Ecumenical Council held not long ago, unquote. This claim is questionable, to say the least, particularly in view of what the Pope will say 1 week later when he openly contradicts Sacrosanctum Concilium, as I'll discuss. But here, the new Missal is said to be 4 things, each of which is surprising. Quote, it is an act of obedience to the Council. It is an act of coherence of the Church with herself. It is a step forward for her authentic tradition. It is a demonstration of fidelity and vitality to which we all must give prompt assent. Unquote. It is quite unclear how coherence of the Church with herself is to be achieved by breaking with much of what the Church had been doing in her most important actions for centuries. That sounds more like incoherence. It is quite unclear how exactly a radically revised Missal counts as a step forward, whatever that means, for the Church's authentic tradition, whatever that means. I do not think it would be unfair to call this double-speak. Again, one is left speechless at the claim that the Novus Ordo is a demonstration of fidelity and vitality. Fidelity to what and how? Vitality just because papal muscle can be flexed to push through the biggest raft of changes in the history of the Church's worship. The speech concludes in a tone almost feverish and certainly imperious, as if the Pope were feeling the total inadequacy of his account. Quote, it is not an arbitrary act. It is not a transitory or optional experiment. It is not some dilettante's improvisation. It is a law. It has been thought out by, wait for it, authoritative experts of sacred liturgy. It has been discussed and meditated upon for a long time, that is, for a few years of extremely hasty committee work. We shall do well to accept it with joyful interest and put it into practice punctually, unanimously, and carefully, unquote. These, it seems to me, are not the words of a man who is especially at peace about what he has done, or confident in the power of the product to win over the customers. One suspects a psychiatrist could have a field day analyzing this language. Pope Paul VI then says that the reform he has imposed, quote, puts an end to uncertainties, discussions, arbitrary abuses. It calls us back to that uniformity of rights and feeling proper to the Catholic Church, unquote. Can irony have no limits? It was in large part the Vatican's practically yearly changes to the liturgy from the 1950s through the 1960s that stirred up this federal atmosphere of uncertainty, discussion, and abuse. It was the insistence on liturgical reform that shattered the uniformity of rights and feeling that the Church had enjoyed in relative peace from the end of the Council of Trent till the 20th century. Moreover, one of the most characteristic features of the Novus Ordo is its lack of uniformity from one celebration to another and its multiplication of Catholic identities. So to say that it's going to put an end to uncertainty, discussion, and arbitrary abuse is rather rich, certainly in hindsight. The second part of the address goes into what exactly the changes are. Whether from ignorance or from duplicity, the Pope states that the changes, quote, consist of many new directions for celebrating the rites, unquote, not adverting at all to the fact that the principal change is in the substance of the texts themselves. For example, in a widely reported number, but I think it can never be said too often, only 17% of the orations of the old Roman Missal survived intact in the new Missal. 17%. And you know what I mean by orations: collect, secret, post-communion. He then has the temerity to say, quote, keep this clearly in mind, nothing has been changed of the substance of the traditional Mass, unquote. That's amazing. I wonder how many people in 1969 believed this. I wonder how many still believe it today. A passage in St. Irenaeus of Lyons, directed against the arbitrary interpretations of the Gnostics, seems to me to capture perfectly what was done in our times with the Roman Rite, as well as the subterfuge of saying, This is the Roman rite, or worse, this is now tradition. This is a bit of a digression, but when I read this text in St. Irenaeus, I thought, that's it. That's a perfect description. So here's what he writes, quote, "Their manner of acting is just as if when a beautiful image of a king has been constructed by some skillful artist out of precious jewels, one should then take this likeness of the man all to pieces, should rearrange the gems, and so fit them together as to make them into the form of a dog or of a fox, and even that but poorly executed, and should then maintain and declare that this was the beautiful image of the king, which the skillful artist constructed, pointing to the jewels, which had been admirably fitted together by the first artist to form the king's image, but had been with bad effect transferred by the latter one to the shape of a dog. And by thus exhibiting the jewels, should deceive the ignorant who have no conception of what a king's form was like, and persuade them that that miserable likeness of the fox was, in fact, the beautiful image of the king." Unquote. Returning to the general audience, we find Paul VI, as if detecting the misgivings his words to this point might generate in the listener, going on the defensive. Quote, "Perhaps some may allow themselves to be carried away by the impression made by some particular ceremony or additional rubric." This is what he says, but in fact the transition from the old to the new is mainly a matter of lost rubrics, not of additional ones, but let that aside. "And thus think that they conceal some alteration or diminution of truths which were acquired by the Catholic faith forever and are sanctioned by it. They might come to believe that the equation between the law of prayer, lex orandi, and the law of faith, lex credendi, is compromised as a result." So, Paul VI couldn't have put it better. But then he continues this way. "It is not so, absolutely not. Above all, because the right and the relative rubric are not in themselves a dogmatic definition. Their theological qualification may vary in different degrees according to the liturgical context to which they refer. They are gestures and terms relating to a religious action, experienced and living, of an indescribable mystery of divine presence, not always expressed in a universal way. Only theological criticism can analyze this action and express it in logically satisfying doctrinal formulas." Unquote. This is a very dense passage, and surprisingly dense, I would say, for a general audience. But we have to pause for a moment and see what he's doing, the move that he's making here. In a spectacular instance of neo-scholastic reductionism, we are told that only dogmatic definitions pertain to the essence of the Catholic faith, since rites and rubrics have to do with experiences and actions that vary according to place and time. So for Paul VI, the only expression of truth is a logically satisfying doctrinal formula. You see what he's doing here. The only thing that can never change is the dogmatic formula. Everything else is up for grabs. There's no stability, there's no kind of in itself permanent value to anything apart from these dogmatic definitions. In these words, Paul VI has obliterated the lex orandi of the Catholic liturgy as a distinctive, complex, holistic, and authoritative reality unto itself. Just as a thought experiment, you can't imagine saying this about the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, right? That is, the Byzantine Christian, the Eastern Christian, would never think about his Divine Liturgy, that the only thing in it that really counts is the dogmatic statements. So it's a very puzzling mentality. Anyway, he continues, quote, "The Mass of the new rite is and remains the same Mass we have always had. If anything, its sameness has been brought out more clearly in some respects." Unquote. As Shakespeare says, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." To belabor the point that the Mass is the same establishes that it isn't, for the obvious need not be said. In order to agree with the sameness hypothesis, one would first have to adopt the perspective that the Roman Rite is nothing other than a generic outline, an introduction, some readings, an anaphora, communion, conclusion. As if to prop up his claim, the Pope rather pathetically turns to the oneness of the Lord's Supper, the sacrifice of the cross, and the representation of both in the Mass, which he says remains true for the Novus Ordo. Apart from the somewhat odd claim that the Mass is a representation of both the cross and the Last Supper, which is not what the 22nd session of the Council of Trent teaches, Trent teaches that the Mass is the making present of the sacrifice of the cross. It doesn't say it's the making present of the Last Supper. But leaving that aside, this, it must be said, is placing the bar of liturgical continuity pretty low. Far from supporting the claim that the Novus Ordo is still the same Roman rite, it demonstrates only that it is a valid liturgical rite. By this logic, one could argue that the Novus Ordo is the same as the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, or the Syro-Malabar rite, or any other rite, if you're just saying it has in common that it's a representation of the sacrifice of Calvary. Still clutching at straws, Paul VI says that the new rite brings out more clearly the relationship between the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, but fails to explain how this is so. And as can be shown both theoretically and practically, the opposite proves to be true. He makes one last plug for the joy of active participation, then, as if running out of steam, declares, "You will also see other marvelous features of our Mass." Why exactly does this plural suddenly appear, our Mass? Is it the papal we, our modern papal rite, as Klaus Gomberg calls it? Is it an oblique reference to the Concilium, our committee Mass that we now present to a Catholic world panting in expectation? Or is this the we of the collectivity that would subsequently find in the Novus Ordo Missae the incentive and indeed the invitation to celebrate itself? Ultimately, it's not our Mass, it's Christ's Mass in which we are privileged to participate. Then another desperate attempt to ram home the sameness thesis. Quote, "But do not think that these things are aimed at altering its genuine and traditional essence." Unquote. We are left once more with the stubborn question that will not go away. What is the genuine and traditional essence of a liturgy? Is it whatever the Pope decides it is, however minimal that may be? Or can we trust the broad lines of historical development and its universal reception in the Church, as the Council of Trent so obviously did? In short, it is hard to imagine two more opposed visions of liturgy than the Council of Trent's and Paul VI's. At the end, he invokes a favorite word of the past half-century, pastoral, as justification, and expresses his desire that, quote, "the faithful will participate in the liturgical mystery with more understanding, in a more practical, a more enjoyable, and a more sanctifying way," unquote. The language here, to my ear, smacks of urban planning and social engineering. How curious then that he refers to, quote, "the Word of God which lives and echoes down the centuries," unquote. That very Word whose ongoing incarnation in the organic development of the liturgy is being repudiated. And then opines that the faithful will better, quote, "share in the mystical reality of Christ's sacramental and propitiatory sacrifice," unquote. Even though the Novus Ordo has purged the liturgy of its palpable mysticism and its unmistakable accentuation of the propitiatory sacrifice of Calvary. All right, so now to the third of these three addresses, these very revealing addresses. 1 week later, on November 26th, 1969, the Pope continues his Apologia. Once again, notice how relentlessly Paul VI underlines the newness of what he is imposing on the Church. In the opening sentence, he speaks of the liturgical innovation of the new rite of the Mass. The phrase new rite is mentioned 7 times. The words new, newness, or renewal 7 more times. Innovation twice, novelty twice. That makes for a total of 18 times in just a couple of pages, as you can see. In classic Montini fashion, his second paragraph lingers regretfully over what is to be lost. And for me, this third address is the most heartrending because of how beautifully Paul VI talks about the old liturgy that he's about to sweep away. So just listen to these words. Quote, "A new rite of the Mass, a change in a venerable tradition that has gone on for centuries. This is something that affects our hereditary religious patrimony, which seemed to enjoy the privilege of being untouchable and settled. It seemed to bring the prayer of our forefathers and our saints to our lips, and to give us the comfort of feeling faithful to our spiritual past, which we kept alive to pass it on to the generations ahead. It is at such a moment as this that we get a better understanding of the value of historical tradition and the communion of the saints." Unquote. As incredible as it may seem, the Pope appears to be saying that when we give up our hereditary religious patrimony, we feel most keenly the value of that tradition and of the communion of saints with whom we once prayed in common. This seems to me a sadistic maneuver, like telling a child, "You will appreciate your mother more if we take her away from you and you never see her again." He continues, resuming themes from his March 1965 address. Quote, "This change will affect the ceremonies of the Mass. We shall become aware, perhaps with some feeling of annoyance, that the ceremonies of the altar are no longer being carried out with the same words and gestures to which we were accustomed, perhaps so much accustomed that we no longer took any notice of them." It's kind of a contradiction, right? If you weren't taking notice of them anymore, why would you be annoyed that they were changing? This change, he says, also touches the faithful. It is intended to interest each one of those present, to draw them out of their customary personal devotions or their usual torpor. Unquote. If I'm not mistaken, Paul VI is arguing that ritual stability causes people to stop paying attention to what is going on and to fold in on themselves in subjectivism or laziness, torpor, as he calls it here. If this were true, it would explain the obsession of modern liturgists with constantly changing things up. As I once remarked, paraphrasing Heraclitus, you can never step in the same Novus Ordo twice. One of the things that I find really disturbing about these addresses is how negative a view Paul VI has of habit. Have you noticed that? Habit is constantly being attacked as something bad, that the Mass is unchanging and that people have a certain familiar way in which they relate to it. He sees that as a bad thing. But for St. Thomas, right, habit is the very foundation of virtue. To become habituated to something is to become connatural with it, to enter fully into it, to make it one with yourself. In the experience of many people, certainly my experience and that of my friends, my family, stability in ritual makes possible a deep intimacy with the Church's prayer, and thereby heads off unhealthy private or collective subjectivism. It's because I recognize again and again the same prayers that they become like an anchor or a rock that can hold me in place and bring me further also. In any case, the Pope seems to be under no illusions about the shake-up when he writes in paragraphs 4 and 5, quote, "We must prepare for this many-sided inconvenience. It is the kind of upset caused by every novelty that breaks in on our habits. We shall notice that pious persons are disturbed most, because they have their own respectable way of hearing Mass, and they will feel shaken out of their usual thoughts and obliged to follow those of others. Even priests may feel some annoyance in this respect. This novelty is no small thing. We should not let ourselves be surprised by the nature or even the nuisance of its exterior forms." Unquote. This hardly requires comment, except to say that Paul VI would never have succeeded as a salesman. It is no wonder so many Catholics stopped going to Mass, and a further wave of priests and religious suffered the crisis of spiritual disorientation, when their supreme shepherd thought it was a good idea to cause especially pious persons and priests a many-sided inconvenience, upset, disturbance, annoyance, and nuisance, as they struggled to figure out what in Hades was going on with the exterior forms, not to say internal spirit, of the Church's liturgy. In the face of this upcoming challenge, and at this point we are 4 days away from when the Novus Ordo goes into effect, what does Paul VI recommend? Like an egg-headed intellectual, out of touch with ordinary Christians, he suggests that we need to prepare ourselves for this special and historical occasion by, don't you know, doubling down on our study of books and articles that explain the motives for this great change. Recognizing again the inherent weakness of his position, he invokes obedience to the council. He knows the lesson of totalitarian propaganda, that the only thing needed to establish a falsehood as truth is to repeat it calmly, boldly, and frequently. And so to say, this is what the council called for, you say it over and over again, priests and people believe that that's true. And adds to it, for good measure, obedience to your bishops. He is confident that all the bishops will be lining up in good ultramontanist, or should we say ultramontaneous fashion. In a moment of almost montanist afflatus, he concludes paragraph 6, quote, "It is Christ's will, it is the breath of the Holy Spirit which calls the church to make this change. A prophetic moment is occurring in the mystical body of Christ, which is the church. This moment is shaking the church, arousing it, obliging it to renew the mysterious art of its prayer." Unquote. In paragraphs 7 through 14, the largest thematic section of the discourse, Paul VI offers a defense of the abolition of Latin. He still seems to be smarting under the lash of Tito Cassini's 1965 book, The Torn Tunic, in which that popular Italian author attacked the introduction of the vernacular into the Mass. The Pope's point of departure in this section is to claim that because, quote, "the faithful are also invested with the royal priesthood, they are qualified to have supernatural conversation with God," unquote. From this truth, which no one had ever denied, Paul VI deduces the necessity of replacing Latin with the common spoken language, for otherwise the people are not able to have a supernatural conversation with God. That's what they call in logic a non sequitur. The Pope starts up his familiar hand-wringing routine, in which he will first tell us how great a loss will be incurred. This, I think, of all of these addresses, the following passage is the one that just tears me up the most. Quote, "The introduction of the vernacular will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. We are parting with the speech of the Christian centuries. We are becoming like profane intruders in the literary preserve of sacred utterance. We will lose a great part of that stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing, the Gregorian chant. We have reason indeed for regret, reason almost for bewilderment. What can we put in the place of that language of the angels? We are giving up something of priceless worth. But why? What is more precious than these loftiest of our church's values?" Unquote. It is at this point that Paul VI shows his cards, advocating a kind of epistemological nudism, or free and simple philosophy. Quote, "The answer will seem banal, prosaic, yet it is a good answer, because it is human, because it is apostolic. Understanding of prayer is worth more than the silken garments in which it is royally dressed." That's the nudism of prayer. "Participation by the people is worth more, particularly participation by modern people, so fond of plain language, which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech." Unquote. Just as an aside here, all the debates that took place some years ago about the new translation of the Novus Ordo Missae, and the progressive liturgists saying, oh no, it's supposed to be plain everyday language, that actually goes right back to Paul VI. He wanted the liturgy to be in plain language, which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech. He says it right here. As our earlier quotation from Dietrich von Hildebrand pointed out, we see here a humanistic, horizontal, and anthropocentric understanding of liturgy that is opposed, paradoxically, to liturgy's very effectiveness as a means of spiritual transformation, drawing the soul up to the infinite God and into communion with the mystical body of Christ, past, present, and eternal. The Latin language is effective precisely because of its beauty, power, and expressive sacrality, its sacred utterance, its priceless worth, the loftiness of its cultural associations, and the stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing that clothes it in music, Gregorian chant. It's the very strangeness and solemnity and formality of Latin that makes it effective. So even from a utilitarian point of view, Paul VI's argument is dubious. Participation in the sense, now I want to pursue this a little bit more because I have found in my discussions with people and in traveling that The Latin question really is one that a lot of people choke on. That's, for them, it's a bridge too far. We can't do liturgy in Latin. And so I want to talk about that just for a moment. Participation, in the sense of the immediate comprehension of plain language easily understood in everyday speech, is the least and lowest sense in which the faithful participate in the awesome mysteries of Christ. Sociologists have pointed out that dense, impenetrable, to some extent off-limits religious rituals are a powerful motivator for belief and devotion. When you see the Byzantine hierarch going back behind the iconostasis in a wave of incense and you can't see him anymore, that doesn't lessen your devotion, that increases your devotion. Father Aidan Nichols observes, quote, "The notion that the more intelligible the sign, the more effectively it will enter the lives of the faithful is implausible. A certain opacity is essential to symbolic action," unquote. So if something is perfectly transparent, well then it ceases to be a symbol, and it ceases to take your mind from here to somewhere else. It just leaves you where you are. Psychologists note that archetypal symbolism conveyed in gestures, like the priest raising his arms, clothing, the maniple, various other aspects, and other physical phenomena, not to say the super-rational language of music, are at least as communicative as words, if not more so. The power of the liturgy to affect the soul depends to a very great extent on such non-verbal elements, and the subtle factor that may be called, for lack of a better term, atmosphere or ambiance. Yes, the faithful should have some grasp of the content of the Mass. Ignorance is not a virtue in this case. And about this, Dom Guéranger and the healthier part of the liturgical movement were doubtless right. But what draws men to liturgical worship as opposed to a Bible study is the prospect of an encounter with the mysterious and the ineffable, the strangely beautiful that opens our minds to the transcendent and offers a glimpse of heaven. In this way, it was exactly anti-apostolic to invert the Church's priorities by placing a superficial notion of popular engagement above the more profound immersion in prayer that the ancient liturgy had always offered to the faithful and still does. In one of the most hauntingly ironic statements in papal history, Pope Paul VI noted with some melancholy in his 1975 apostolic exhortation Evangelii Nunciandi, quote, "Modern man is sated by talk. He is obviously tired of listening, and what is worse, impervious to words," unquote. This observation was made only 6 years after he had imposed on the Church a liturgy outstanding for its non-stop verbosity, huge doses of scripture, lack of silence, and paucity of non-verbal ritual. So will the real Paul VI please stand up? Back in the 1969 address, Pope Paul, however, proceeds to dig himself into a hole. Quote, "If the divine Latin language kept us apart from the children, from youth, from the world of labor and of affairs, if it were a dark screen, not a clear window, would it be right for us fishers of souls to maintain it as the exclusive language of prayer and religious intercourse?" Unquote. So here Paul is asking what he thinks is a rhetorical question. Latin is keeping away the children, the youth, the laborers, the men of affairs. Well, let's think about that for a moment. The most dramatic decline in Mass attendance in the decade after the Council, that is, from the first introduction of the vernacular and versus populum to the imposition of the Novus Ordo, was found precisely among the laborers, as English sociologist Anthony Archer demonstrated. It was the people who were uneducated, who were not classic scholars, who were most alienated by the change. Furthermore, it is by no means clear that men of affairs ever favored the liturgical reform. I've already mentioned Cassini, von Hildebrand, Waugh, Buckley, but the most embarrassing sign of the lack of support among educated people came in 1971 with a petition urging the preservation of the traditional Latin Mass, signed by 56 of the most eminent cultural figures of Great Britain, many of the foremost writers, critics, academics, and musicians of the day, as well as politicians from Britain's then 3 main parties and 2 Anglican bishops, which John Cardinal Heenan presented to Pope Paul VI, an intervention that led to the English indult which is sometimes called the Agatha Christie indult because she was one of the signatories of 56, for the continued use of the Old Mass. This English indult of 1971 was, in retrospect, the first step in a long process of backtracking on the overblown claims that had been made for the new epoch to be ushered in by the Reform. Lastly, Paul VI's mention of children and youth may remind us of what is perhaps the sharpest irony of all. While the average number of children born to mainstream Catholics and the average retention rate of young adults continues to be alarmingly low, the numbers of large families and the overall youthfulness of the traditional Mass movement tell a very different story about what attracts people to Christ and what pushes them away. In paragraphs 13 and 14, the Pope throws a sop to Latin lovers by reminding them that the new rite of Mass allows for the people to sing together in Latin the ordinary of the Mass, an allowance that was almost never to be actualized in practice. I read a letter from 1972 by Neil McCaffrey, where he said, the Church will sooner bring back the burning of heretics than the Novus Ordo in Latin. And he says Latin will still remain the official language of Vatican documents, cold comfort if ever there was any. Without any indication of sarcasm, he says, quote, Latin will remain as the key to the patrimony of our religious, historical, and human culture. If possible, it will re-flourish in splendor, unquote. Yet if Latin is really the key to our Catholic patrimony, why are we making the one move most calculated to destroy its living presence in the Church? How will this help Latin re-flourish in splendor? In paragraph 15, Paul VI takes up his theme from the previous week, that the Mass hasn't really changed because, quote, the fundamental outline of the Mass is still the traditional one, not only theologically but also spiritually, unquote. If by fundamental outline, one means that some kind of penitential thing comes first, some kind of Eucharistic prayer comes around the middle, and some kind of gesture indicating the end of the service comes last, one can warmly agree with the Pope's assessment. Here we would not have the time to go through a lengthy list of examples of the ways in which the structure, theology, and spirituality of the new Missal clearly differ or depart from those of the old Missal. But it takes little more than attendance at the Usus Antiquior to begin to see for oneself that the application of the word traditional to the Reformed liturgical rites of Paul VI is precisely the sort of abuse of language, abuse of power, about which the philosopher Josef Pieper, who lived under the National Socialist regime in Germany, wrote so eloquently. Then Paul VI has either the naivete or the shamelessness to assert, quote, indeed, if the rite is carried out as it ought to be, the spiritual aspect will be found to have greater richness. The greater simplicity of the ceremonies, the variety and abundance of scriptural texts, the joint acts of the ministers, the silences which will mark various deeper moments in the rite, will all help to bring this out, unquote. As long as everyone participates profoundly, he says, the Mass will become, quote, more than ever a school of spiritual depth and a peaceful but demanding school of Christian sociology. The soul's relationship with Christ and with the brethren thus attains new and vital intensity, unquote. In lines like this, we see Paul VI abandoning himself to full-scale fantasy land. The last three paragraphs, 17 through 19, form a bizarre coda that conveys to us even today, at a distance of 5 decades, something of the feeling of slapdash haste and scarcely controlled chaos that surrounded the entire project of liturgical reform. Quote, but there is still a practical difficulty, which the excellence of the sacred renders not a little important. What an expression. How can we celebrate this new rite when we have not yet got a complete missal, and there are still so many uncertainties about what to do? Unquote. Good question, Holy Father. It was a question that had rarely left the lips of clergy and laity for a good 15 years by this point, as rubrics, texts, music, language, nearly everything continue to evolve on an almost annual basis. Sort of like, what new rubric is going to show up in the mail today? What we see in this madness for sacramental reform starting regrettably under Pius XII, is the very negation of the correct Catholic attitude towards tradition, which is that of a gardener, not that of an industrialist or a real estate developer who knocks down the old mansion to make way for modern flats. If I might adapt some recent words of Father John Hunnick, the Pope needs, quote, to remember the aperçu of Blessed John Henry Newman, that the ministry of the Roman Church within the oikumene is to be a barrier, a remora, against the intrusion of erroneous novelty. It is to hand on the great tradition unadulterated. In an age when the adjective negative has unpopular vibes, we need a reappropriation at the very highest level within the Church of the central fundamental importance of a negative and preservative papacy. Tradidi quod accepi, I have handed down what I have received, implies quod non accepi non tradam, what I have not received, I do not hand down. Unquote. Having posed this question about how we're going to celebrate this, Paul VI answers it with rather more technical detail than one would expect in a general audience. I will spare you the details. You have it anyway. The takeaway is that Latin liturgy is definitely on its way out, and that by the Pope's express will. By November 28, 1971, he says, there are to be no more Latin liturgies from the Old Missal or even from the New one. And if a priest expects to find himself in various places, offering Mass alone and with a congregation, he had better invest in a stout wagon for carrying all the liturgical books he will need. The old days when an altar missal sufficed are hereby excluded in the name of greater simplicity of rites. The address closes with a final subtle irony, a quotation from one of Paul VI's favorite authors, the Swiss priest and theologian Maurice Zundel, 1897 to 1975. From the preface to Zundel's second edition of the Poème de la Sainte Liturgie of 1934, which was published in English in 1939 under the title The Splendor of the Liturgy. So here's how Paul VI ends. Quote, "The Mass is a mystery to be lived in a depth of love. Its divine reality surpasses all words. It is the action par excellence, the very act of our redemption in the memorial which makes it present." Unquote. I do not know what Zundel, who died in 1975, thought of the Novus Ordo Missae, but I can say without a doubt, anyone who reads this book from 1934, a profound work of mystical theology, which from start to finish is steeped in prayers and ceremonies of the classic Roman Rite, enters into a world of luminous wonder and fiery devotion, the epitome of a church securely and gratefully rooted in her tradition. This world was doomed by Paul VI's interim missal of 1965 and banished by the perfidious Missale Romanum of 1969. To a poor layman or priest standing in the audience hall on November 19th or November 26th of that fateful year, the glorious and intimate world described in Zundel seemed on the verge of being lost forever. Thanks be to God, it has not been lost, but can you imagine what it looked like in November 1969? I can't because I wasn't born. So let me draw now some conclusions. Revisiting these audiences 5 decades later is important for many reasons. I'm just going to talk about 2 reasons. The main reason is that, considering the magnitude of the reform, Paul VI's defense of it is exceedingly flimsy. Some people saw that already back in 1965 and 1969. Some very important people. But today it is overwhelmingly clear, with the benefit of a hindsight that shows how narrow and dated are his assumptions, and how his every prediction has failed. Montini's defense of the Novus Ordo relies on equivocation, deceitfulness about the extent of the changes, and a brute exercise of top-down authority. It is based on a poor theology of liturgy, sacraments, and prayer, a poor sociology of ritual, a poor psychology of habit, and a poor philosophical analysis of modernity. A second reason why it's important to look back at these audiences has to do with the so-called hermeneutic of continuity, and the once glamorous project of a reform of the reform. Proponents of the reform, no doubt in good faith, I was one of them for many years, cling to a narrative in which the Novus Ordo Missae came hot off the Vatican press, clothed in Latin as with a garment, ready to be celebrated in splendor and solemnity to the noble strains of Gregorian chant, in perfect fulfillment of the conciliar constitution Sacrosanctum Concilium. And then the Mass got hijacked by European and American progressives who flatly contradicted the good intentions of Paul VI. A basic problem with this narrative is that it's false. The three general audiences indicate that Paul VI never thought that the Novus Ordo would be celebrated widely in Latin. He never expected Gregorian chant to survive in the parishes. He never wanted our Mass to look or sound like the inherited Roman liturgy. He calmly noted that Latin and Gregorian chant would disappear. The old way of celebrating Mass would perish from the face of the earth. To this extent, then, he sought rupture, not the continuity for which his successor Benedict XVI has become famous. Certainly, Paul VI could have heartily endorsed the words of influential liturgist and concilium member Joseph Gélineau, quote, "Let those who, like myself, have known and sung a Latin Gregorian High Mass remember it if they can. Let them compare it with the Mass that we now have. Not only the words, the melodies, and some of the gestures are different. To tell the truth, it is a different liturgy of the Mass. This needs to be said without ambiguity. The Roman Rite as we knew it no longer exists. It has been destroyed." Unquote. Now, the obvious question comes to our minds. What was the operative principle that was driving Paul VI? Can we try to find the Urprinzip, the fundamental principle that's driving these addresses? I think we can. I think we can call it accommodationism. The liturgy must be accommodated to the mentality and purported needs of modern man, with a capital M, modern man. To this hungry Moloch of modernization, every other consideration had to yield. Indeed, the first sacrificial offering to be placed in its mouth was the Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. It requires no towering intelligence to see that some of Sacrosanctum Concilium's clearest and most important provisions were not only ignored, but negated. I'm just going to mention here, too, that are undoubtedly familiar to you, that Latin is to remain the language of the Roman Rite, and that Gregorian chant is to have pride of place in liturgical ceremonies. Those are both said by Vatican II. Paul VI acted, therefore, against the provisions signed by 2,147 bishops and major superiors in an exercise of hyper-papalism that has no other historical equivalent and probably never will. In this way, he exhibited an extreme megalomania that could be summed up in the phrase, "L'Église, c'est moi." I am the church. These three audiences illustrate a more general trend. We can see an exact parallel to them in the manner in which the Vatican, after the Council, discouraged culturally Catholic nations from preserving any special constitutional recognition of or agreement with the Church, such as Spain and Italy, and in the disastrous policy towards the communist countries known as Ostpolitik, which has resurfaced in Pope Francis's sellout to the Chinese government. We see it in the encouragement of ugly modern art, with the Paul VI Audience Hall, opened in 1971 as its preeminent monument. We see it in the discouragement of clerical attire and large families. In other words, we are looking at a comprehensive program of secularization under the guise of spiritualization. Secularization under the guise of spiritualization. A program of conformity to the liberal Western world forged in the anti-clerical Enlightenment and repackaged after World War II as optimistic humanism. This was the defining ethos of the Vatican II period as interpreted and advanced by and under Pope Paul VI. And this is and was contrary to the fundamental demand of Christianity, according to St. Paul in the Epistle to the Romans. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. That's Romans 12:2. The great American Catholic writer of the 19th century, Orestes Brownson, wrote in July 1846, quote, "The Church is not here to follow the spirit of the age, but to control and direct it, often to struggle against it. They do her the greatest disservice who seek to disown her glorious past and to modify it as far as possible so as to adapt her to the prevailing methods of thought and feeling. It is her zealous but mistaken friends who, guided by a short-sighted policy and taking counsel of the world around them, seek, as they express it, to liberalize her, to bring her more into harmony with the spirit of the age, from whom we, as good Catholics, should always pray, libera nos Domine." Unquote. Martin Mosebach speaks of, quote, "the defective liturgical development that was encouraged by a mentality antagonistic to spiritual realities," unquote. This, in fact, is what we see in Paul VI's accommodationism, a mentality so preoccupied with modernity, with evangelization, and with accessibility that it ends up becoming antagonistic to spiritual realities. And by that I mean, by spiritual realities, I mean the set apartness of the sacred, the primacy of God and the things of God, the otherworldly itinerary of Christ in his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension, and the conquest of this world for Christ the King, seizing it from Satan's empire and sanctifying it with her mystic benedictions derived from apostolic discipline and tradition. A 19th century German theologian, Johann Adam Müller, not like Cardinal Müller, Johann Adam Müller, said this, quote, "If one cannot trust tradition, then Christians would rightly despair of ever learning what Christianity really is. They would rightly despair that there is a Holy Spirit which fills the Church, that there exists a common spirit and sure knowledge of Christianity. This is the state in which those who reject tradition find themselves, and for them there can be no such thing as an objective Christianity." Thank you for your kind